Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
Well, we're very much in the winter period, and I thought for 2 weeks I would look at two significant Old Testament passages and open them up in an expository way, in a way that I hope is helpful to all of us to reflect upon what they have to say to us. Tonight I shall be looking at 2 Kings chapter 5, and then next week looking in the book of Amos. I want to talk about listening to ordinary people. Now, there's a note of pathos about this particular passage in 2 Kings chapter 5, and it's really summed up in the words that we find in the opening verse. At the end of that first verse, we read about this particular commander of the army of the king of Aram, and this is what it says. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. A valiant soldier on one hand, leprosy on the other. Now, the two things are so fundamentally different. One gives a person standing and place within the community, and one does the exact opposite. And there's also something that's interesting to note also. Naaman, the name, the names of the Bible often communicate something very powerful, actually means pleasant. Well, it's interesting that when we read a story about Naaman whose name is pleasant, we are faced with the most unpleasant of circumstances. A very interesting play. It's important to also recognize that leprosy is a generic term. Now, we have our pictures in our minds about leprosy. Carol and I spent some time in India, and when we went there, we went to a leper colony for a number of hours. We spent time with lepers there, many who had got very, very little by the way of limbs, many who had to crawl across the floor to make any kind of movement, and it was quite striking. However, the term has a generic sense too. What we can say is it is a skin disease, and one that has a powerful impact, and one that carries with it social stigma. And that really is the most important part of all. So we're looking, however, at something that's far more than just a skin disease. We're looking at something that separates you from people, something that makes you castigated in the sight of other people. Now, Naaman was known to be a proud person. That's important. In this passage, we pick up that truth about him. A proud person who believed others should treat him with respect also and deference. It's therefore significant in the fact that in this passage, Naaman has to listen to the advice of somebody who is very ordinary to find healing. Here is a man who is used to giving orders, but who has to receive the advice of someone to be able to find healing. In the narrative, when Elisha, later on in the passage, didn't come out to greet him and didn't come out to do what he wanted him to do, he's really quite put out by that. He storms off. He's angry. His reaction to the fact that people didn't treat him as a commander, as an officer, a person of standing, is part of what this passage has to teach to us. He was encouraged to do something when we come to the end of the passage, to go and bathe in the river 7 times, 7 of course being a significant number in itself. And one writer even suggested that he may well have thought this was some kind of political trick to just kind of confront him and make him look humiliated. Now, the role of servants and ordinary people in the Bible, and particularly in the Old Testament, are very, very interesting. For those who worked for Naaman had the wisdom to encourage him to obey what the prophet had asked. The one who was used to giving orders now had to accept advice. However, after persuasion, he does do that. The fact that a person has high standing is prepared not only to do what the prophet asked, but also to do it at the behest of a servant becomes a powerful message. The success of Naaman's 7 dips in the Jordan are going to be very, very important. They would fundamentally change his attitude, not only to the prophets, but to the way he lived his life. And the verse that follows, those first 15 verses that were read to us by Bryce just a few moments ago here in the theatre, This is the word. It says, now I know there is no God in all the world except in Israel. That text is an important text because it tells us that what happened to this man who had leprosy not only made him feel better, not only changed his physical condition, but changed his attitudinal condition. Something happens. And I've chosen this title of Listening to Ordinary People because I think that that's so important. He suffered a greater malady than leprosy. It was something bigger than the fact he had a physical disposition that needed to be experienced. Peter Marshall, of course, he was a great chaplain in Washington, in his own wonderful way, captured the heart of this in one of his prayers that his wife put together after his all too early death. In a prayer, he says, Lord, where we're wrong, make us willing to change. And where we're right, make us easy to live with. I think that's a lovely kind of insight into what we're dealing with here. Because this passage is not just about healing, it's about pride. And it's about the pride of a very, very powerful person. Pride can be defined in relation to our relying on ourselves rather than relying on God. In much of the Christian moral tradition, pride is seen as sinful. It's understood as self-congratulation. This puffed-up spirit is not consistent with what we meet in the person of Jesus Christ. The Bible is replete with stories of how God uses ordinary people, peasants, children, people who are outside of the understanding of being amongst those collective people. God uses ordinary people to teach people of power a good deal about his grace. And it's important, I think, for us to recognize, even in human success, that we are not the people who have created it always. Of course, there are some things about pride that are bound to be there. If when the Rio Olympics happened, if they happened here in one of our members had a son who was running in the 100 meters, somebody who was swimming. If we had somebody there, well, of course, you'd be silly if you didn't have some sense of pride in your own family. However, the pride that is crushingly wrong in this passage, so obviously presented to us, is the pride of belief in oneself above God. And that really is important. Let's consider the positive aspects. Aristotle, spoke of pride as the crown of the virtues, although even then it was the mean between two extremes of undue humility and vanity. Nobody would want to deny the positive connotation when a father says, I'm very proud of you, son. When somebody says to their daughter, I'm very proud of what you've achieved. Aesop's fables are a favourite of mine. I remember them they've got so much to say to us. Now, he tells a fable one day of all the animals were having a debate. And they were debating about who had the largest litters. And some talked about having twins and triplets, and one of the animals bragged of having a dozen or more offspring at one time. Finally, the lioness stepped forward, rather quietly contributed to the conversation. Only one, she said, but that one is a lion. And the pride that Aesop talks about in that moment is the pride that we see in this particular passage here. Naaman's affliction of pride could be argued to be one that is most seen in our lives, one of the most difficult things to handle. Let's look a little closer at Naaman's situation. He experienced success. We're told that he was a commander in the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master, highly regarded. Highly regarded. He'd had victories. He'd had things that made him a person of standing. It would have taken time to get to the kind of position that Naaman held. And the respect that he has indicates he was more than just a soldier. He was somebody who gained that kind of respect from others. Certainly, one of the messages in this passage doesn't necessarily mean that because you've got standing that you're going to be protected from life's disappointments. Isn't that a powerful message? that here is somebody who can find themselves in that situation of leprosy, even though he's got such standing in the community. When referring to Naaman's splendid reputation, perhaps we ought to refer to his apparent success. Just like AIDS has been in our day for many, many people, leprosy was no respecter of people. With AIDS, there are numerous examples of unhealthy promiscuity, the accidental use of needles, or the completely innocent transfusion of blood. Who can forget Arthur Ashe? Does some remember Arthur Ashe, the great black tennis player from North America? The one who knew what it was to be a success in so many ways. He won the US Open, Wimbledon, and the Australian Open. He died from an AIDS-related illness following a blood transfusion during his second bypass surgery in 1983. He and his wife Jean at first kept this secret from everybody. They didn't talk about it because it was something that they wanted to remain hidden until, of course, there was no other alternative as his health quickly deteriorated. I use that illustration because many successful people have burdens to bear. Many people of standing have things that they want to hide because they know that they're a part of their life and their pride won't allow them to be seen for what they were. What was it like the day he discovered he had leprosy? Did he discover it stood before the mirror? Did he see somehow his skin was turning white in places and things were changing on the skin that was there? Did he want to keep the news very private? If so, how did a servant find out? Now that tells you maybe something very important. Maybe the servant standing in their home was so close and affectionate that she was able to hear that news through her mistress, his wife. Pride is most dangerous when it relates to the deep areas of our spirituality. Perhaps the most subtle form of pride is when a person aspires to or claims some kind of advanced and superior place. This isn't suggestive of Naaman, but there's a message there for all of us. He kept the secret to himself. I can only begin to speculate about that, but let me tell you, I once knew a man whose marriage had broken up. And he didn't tell anybody about it. He carried on living his life as though nothing had happened. Everything was happening day by day in the usual way. But the truth was, there was no wife at home. When Christmas came, Christmas cards were sent from both the people. And my heart went out to this man as I tried to minister to him and help him. Of course, he would want help, but he wanted to keep the news to himself. And I think of that when I think of this great man, this great person in the community who had achieved a great deal, but who had this secret. The close relationships within the household meant that somebody would find this out eventually. Now, pride does more than that. Pride often hinders progress. The pride of Naaman is demonstrated in the way he expresses his sadness regarding the prophet's response. Once he's been persuaded to go to see the king, and the king puts him on to the right people, it's who you know and where you know them, and all this happened, he's really quite shocked. Remember, he's a man of standing. He expects VIP treatment. He actually says, I would have expected the prophet to at least have come out and waved his hands around and done something special for me. After all, I am special, am I not? And this pride really hinders things because it means that he can't be open to what it is that God wants to do in his life. Naaman imagined that he would be healed by some kind of magical technique. J. Oswald Saunders, in his outstanding book, Spiritual Leadership, writes this: nothing is more distasteful to God than self-conceit. This first and fundamental sin, in essence, aims at enthroning self at the expense of God. Pride is a sin of whose presence its victim is least conscious. a sin which the victim that is least conscious is self. Elisha realized that this physical disease could only be cured if the underlying spiritual disease could also be healed. In this case, pride. Pride prevented Naaman from seeking help, and yet it took a very insignificant person in the world's eyes to put him on to the real solution. So much so, in fact, that when the king was contacted, the king's also got the problem of pride. Because he tears his clothes and says, I can't do anything about this. The faithfulness of those considered insignificant. There's an underlying theme here that God uses people who are often thought insignificant. For example, peasants, women who were little regarded, children and people of other races. You turn through the Bible, you'll find time and time again, it's insignificant people that have the greatest power. In this particular biblical context, those thoughts are brought together. Now, at this particular time, there was something important. On one of Naaman's military engagements, he brought home a captured young girl, and his wife employed her in her home. The relationship's good because she obviously spoke about Naaman's illness. We're told she said to her mistress, if only my master would seek the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. I want to know what the conversation was like that led to that. Did she sit down and weep with her servant as she talked about her husband's malady? But it certainly has about it a real sense of warmth in the situation. Empathy and compassion provoked her to share. Now, Israel and Syria at this particular time were technically at peace. But one of the things we discover when we do Old Testament history is that there were skirmishes happening all the time. And the whole of the Middle East has been in a turmoil for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there were often skirmishes where people would go in and do something and take people out. So taking a prisoner of a young girl was not strange. It's the sort of thing that actually happened. This is something about this young girl. Her lowly position would keep her from being proud. She didn't have to go to a counselor to talk about pride, because she had no standing that would give her that feel about herself. Her lowly position didn't prevent her from having concern for others. Isn't that lovely? That though she didn't have to, her heart went out to somebody who was actually ill in this way. And her lowly position is matched with a good relationship with others. This servant's faithfulness is indicated by her knowledge about the prophet. She knew all about the prophet. She'd heard all about the man of God who could do far more than she could ever imagine. She said to her mistress, if only my master would go and see the prophet. The influence of someone of apparent insignificance meant that Naaman went to see the king. Now, something else that's worth noting is people of influence can be very foolish, you know. You see that, don't you, in politics? You see it in public life. People who think they've got great standing sometimes make foolish decisions. And here's an example of it. When Naaman's wife informed him of his ray of hope that came from the lips of the servant girl, he spoke to Ben-Hadad, who in turn sent him to Naaman with a letter of introduction. Not unreasonably, the assumption was that the king controlled the prophet. This wasn't the case. And so he takes with him many, many things. The truth is that the leprosy would mean he was cut off from people. And the thing he thought was, I can buy my way through this situation. We're told, let's listen to the list of what he took with him. So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. He thought somehow he could buy his healing if he only took with him all the things that would be of importance in this world. People often choose the wrong course of action when seeking to find the way of God. People sometimes believe that the amassing of possessions is going to make it much easier to find a way that's there. This often causes an opposite, unhelpful response. You know, recognizing our need is the first step in Christian discipleship. Recognizing our need is the first way in which we discover a way of healing. There's a little ditty that runs like this. Sometime when you're feeling important, sometime when your ego's way up, sometime when you take it for granted that you are the prize-winning pup, sometime when you're feeling that your absence would leave an unfillable role, just follow these simple instructions and see how it humbles your soul. Take a bucket and fill it with water. Put your hand in it up to your wrist. Now pull it out fast, and the hole that remains is the measure of how you'll be missed. You may splash all you like as you please and you enter, and stir up the water galore, but stop, and you'll find in a minute it's back where it was just before. And I think that we sort of need to address that within ourselves, all of us, whoever we are, whatever position we have, whatever we see ourselves are, there can be an influence that of people of significance sometimes feel, and it's foolishness. Foolishness. Healing is of his whole person. This is the great thing about this healing. When Naaman knows what it is to be healed, it won't just be that he is suddenly able to have clean skin. It will be that he can have relationships with people. It will mean, of course, that he can have real access into what is important. News of the king's response reached the ears of Elisha. Remember what Elisha said when he heard what the king had done? The king tore his robes. That's a symbolic thing. Throughout the Old Testament, you'll see examples of it. He tore his robes. Why have you torn your robes? Said the message of the prophet. Make the man come to me, and he will know that there's a prophet in Israel. Presumably the king sent a message to Naaman, and consequently Naaman goes to the prophet's house. We're told how he arrives. Just imagine the scene for a moment. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at Elisha's house. All the staff are out there. A big do this is. He arrives at the prophet's house full of all his own self-importance. And so a message is sent in. And what does a prophet do? He sends a message out. He sends a message out. And you can see the anger that Naaman thought, I've come all this way to see you, and all you've done is send a message out with another ordinary person. Another comparatively insignificant person who is so profoundly important in this passage of Scripture. And we're told that he told him a simple message. Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be healed. You know, the instructions are intended to demonstrate that healing comes from the power of God. You remember, and the reason he's annoyed, he says, aren't Abana and Pharpar and all the rivers of Damascus, aren't they just as good? Why should I go down there and be washed? And why should I do that? Can't you come out and perform some miraculous healing here and now? Ritual washings were important in Old Testament scripture, and indeed into the New Testament and in much Eastern religion. So what was Naaman's reaction to the message? He went away angry. He felt deprived of a personal reception. He felt deprived of his own significance and worth being declared. He felt that he'd been asked to go to the Jordan as some kind of insult. Naaman had got his own idea. He thought a bit of performance was what was required in this particular instance. And today, even followers of Jesus Christ prefer spectacular demonstrations of life rather than the simple path of salvation, rather than something that's real. Russell Dilday comments this: they will suffer, build churches, give money, sacrifice privileges, and because the plan is so simple, many turn away as Naaman did and refuse the greatest of gifts. Here's the turning point. If Naaman isn't prepared to face his pride now, he will not be healed. If he is prepared to do so, he will be healed. He was brought to a halt. Although Naaman turns away, his staff are more pragmatic. Again, ordinary people. You see, this is the 3rd time we've seen ordinary people in this passage. The staff get involved here. They tell him, Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had asked you to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? How much more when he tells you, wash and be cleansed?" You see, sometimes we want the complicated way. We want the fancy way. We want something that's over and above. He was brought to a halt on his journey. To Naaman's credit, he goes to the Jordan and he is cleansed. Jesus Christ often replicated the work in the prophets. He both healed lepers and illustrated faith through them. Remember, I can't help but whenever I think of those 10 lepers, remember the 10 lepers and only one of them said thank you? That even in there you have this feeling that something like this Old Testament story might well have been in the minds of some people in that kind of incident. He gave them conventional instruction requirements to show themselves to the priest, but only one returned to show gratitude. And then finally, he received God's saving power in choosing the right way. God was at work in the life of this successful and often self-reliant man. What did Naaman have to lose except his pride? It's surely one of the best known of these Old Testament passages that you find in Kings. Marvellous story pointing to the deeper aspects of human nature. Now we can choose to read this Old Testament story at a superficial level, or we can ask, what has it got to say to us? Pride is a major challenge in life. We see it in politics and public life. We know it can cause the breakdown in human and family relationships. There are far too many examples, and it damages human personality at the deepest and most profound level. As followers of Jesus Christ, we need to be reasonable judges of ourselves if we're to offer meaningful service to the world. Gerhard von Rad helpfully observes that Elisha leaves Naaman completely to his new faith or better, to God's hand which has sought him and found him. Charles Swindoll, tells the story of a pastor who was voted as the most humble pastor in America. What a title. And everybody, the news went around the church, everybody was talking about it. The most humble pastor, our pastor is the most humble pastor in America. And some of the elders struck a badge. And on the badge were the words, the most humble pastor in America. And everything went swimmingly well until he wore it at church the next Sunday. And in the stupidity of Swindoll's story is an awfully powerful truth for every one of us.